In this episode of Weird Ass Books, the complete stories of J G Ballard. One of the best purchases I made at the beginning of the COVID pandemic was this massive, nearly 1,200-page collection of J G Ballard stories. Previously, I'd only read The Atrocity Exhibition and The Drowned World, two novels by Ballard, but I was familiar with him mostly because of the film adaptations of his works, which I'll talk about in a second. But I'll start by just giving some biographical information about Mr. Ballard. He's a British writer, and he had an interesting upbringing. He was actually born in Shanghai, China, in 1930. And when World War II started, the Japanese took over Shanghai, and him and his family ended up in an internment camp when he was around 13 in 1943. These experiences that he had in the internment camp were recounted in a semi-autobiographical novel called Empire of the Sun, which was turned into a film by Steven Spielberg in 1987, starring Christian Bale. And that's probably how most people have heard of J G Ballard. It's probably the most famous adaptation of his work or example of his work. Ballard's work had also been adapted into film by David Cronenberg with his 1996 film Crash, not to be confused with the terrible 2000s film Crash, directed by Paul Haggis, I believe. And also there was a film version of his novel High Rise. The novel was written in 1975 and the film came out in 2015, I believe. And I think the BBC has also adapted some of his other work, although I haven't seen or really know much about those adaptations. Ballard is one of those authors or artists that sort of is their own genre, the way that Kafka is, or David Lynch. You know, people say Kafkaesque or Lynchian, and I really think Ballardian deserves to be considered in that same way. He has very persistent themes throughout his work, which is mostly science fiction, although the Empire of the Sun novel has no real science fiction themes, of the ways in which technology is affecting psyche. He has an obsession in his writing with dystopias and natural disasters and the ways in which those things affect the human mind, really. Most of his work that I've read has a dark and sinister bent to it, and sometimes deep inside his darkness is a British, dry sense of humor, absurd humor. But for the most part, his work is driven by a dark obsession with technology. Other themes that run throughout Ballard's work are issues of consumerism, ennui, the anxiety and malaise that are a result of technological advances and corporate consumerism. He also has a pretty obvious obsession with aeronautics and the way that those mechanical analog technology works and interfaces with humanity. So Ballard is really ahead of his time in a lot of ways, in the way he presages the way that our collective anxiety has been amplified by technology that should be making our lives easier, but in some ways makes us just more addled, essentially. Oftentimes in his work, the inner landscape of the human psyche and the outer landscape have a relationship, which you could call kind of an expressionism. He also is clearly influenced by surrealism, and he makes direct references to artists like Salvador Dali, Max Ernst, and Max Ernst's partner, Lenora Carrington. He also references Kandinsky and Magritte and other surrealists. It should be noted that Ballard has also had a huge effect on musicians and music. A lot of musicians have used his work as inspiration, including Joy Division with the song Atrocity Exhibition. And I know Ian Curtis was obsessed with the novel High Rise as well. Other bands that were influenced by Ballard are Hawkwind, Merzbow, Gary Newman, and the song Video Killed the Radio Star is actually directly influenced by one of the stories in this collection, The Sound Sweep. So this collection came out in 2009, and previously it was there were two volumes that you could get his short stories, and this collection actually has those two volumes in addition to a couple other stories that I think were previously only available in other publications. The stories in this collection range from 1956 to 1992, so that's a pretty large period of time, and there's about 100 stories in the collection. And personally, I would recommend, unless you want to really be immersed in his world, to spread it out and read other books in between the stories, as I did. Otherwise, it can become a really overwhelming experience. So, like a lot of science fiction writers, in the new wave. The content of his stories really transforms in the late 60s and the early 70s, which, as I've said before, I think has a lot to do with the way that society was changing with the counterculture. The early stories in this book are much more traditional and familiar if you are a fan of the Twilight Zone or other early science fiction where there's a technological kernel or MacGuffin, and usually there's some kind of sort of didactic or moral tale that is easily digestible. Although I will say, right before I had read this collection of short stories, I had read the complete stories of Frank Herbert, who's a writer I love. I love Dune and some of his other work. But immediately going from that to the Ballard, it was clear that Ballard's writing is just worlds beyond what Herbert was able to do, I think, in terms of his storytelling ability and the ways in which he's able to tell a compelling narrative, and just his overall use of vocabulary and his sensibility, I just felt was so much more mature. Although, I don't want to speak too ill of Frank Herbert because I think he's done some amazing work. And Dune and God Emperor of Dune specifically are some of my favorite novels. But it was really interesting to just go from being immersed in Herbert's short stories and to go to Ballard. I felt that Ballard was just a more mature sensibility, even in his mid-50s period. Once you get to the late 60s and early 70s with Ballard, you really get more mature themes. He's not as afraid of including sexuality in his writing, and the stories themselves are not as tidy, and he's not afraid to use ambiguity or to allow things to kind of fester in the reader's mind instead of telling them how they should feel. He's not as afraid for there to be a lack of resolution. The stories become less fable-like. He experiments more with form itself. He doesn't hold the audience's hand as much, as maybe the easiest way to put it. A few things to note about the short story collection is that he uses this location called Vermilion Sands, which is a decaying resort town. And even though multiple stories in the collection take place in Vermilion Sands, at least I couldn't really account for there being any real connection, characters being reused, or even locations within Vermilion Sands being reused, or technology that he explores in each Vermilion Sands location being the same. So it's sort of like this dream world that he plays in, but it's not like the Vermilion Sands stories connect in any obvious, clear way. Ballard also clearly has an obsession or a preoccupation with islands and archipelagos and exotic landscapes, which play a lot into the imagery and throughout his work and throughout the collection. And also, as you get further into the stories, once you get into the 70s especially, he seems to be very interested in the ways that human spaceflight specifically has affected the human mind and human psychology, and just the idea of astronauts themselves, how that changes our perception of the world and our psychology. So just to go through some of my favorite stories throughout the collection, I would start with the first one, which is Escapement, which is a story about time slippage and the subjectivity of time. Venus Smiles from 1957 is a story like some of his earlier ones or some of the Vermilion Sands stories that uses technology as a focal point. And this one, it's about a guy who makes sound sculptures. And other stories involve like cloud sculpting, and there's one about clothes that are alien. This is a way in which he does, I think, stand out from other science fiction writers, is that there's just sort of a more organic quality to his advanced tech in his stories. And there's always kind of a sinister feeling and vibe to those stories. Another really Twilight Zone fable-esque story is one called Now Zero from 1959, which actually kind of also reminded me of something like Kafka or Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, where it's this alienated worker who he discovers he has the ability to change reality just based on his letters. And so he's able to basically write headlines that control reality. So if he doesn't like his coworker, he can just kind of say, so-and-so died on this day, and then that occurs. And so that's kind of a very Poe, monkey's paw kind of story idea. But again, that's a good example of the more Poe-esque, fable-esque early stories. 1960s The Sound Sweep is sort of in that vein. It's about a guy who kind of has this vacuum cleaner that's able to absorb sounds that are permeating or like phantoms in people's homes. And so he's assigned to be a sound sweep at this female opera singer's house who's like trying to get rid of like the phantoms of these songs. And in this world, people listen to music in like this hypersonic way where they don't listen to normal audio anymore. They experience like an entire Beethoven symphony in like 15 seconds with this hypersonic sound system. Chronopolis from 1960 is a sort of Orwellian dystopian tale about the ways time itself becomes stratified and different classes, social classes, are affected by how you are able to experience time. And there's like these color codings. Again, he's getting into the subjectivity of reality and the ways in which we can be controlled by how things are defined. The Overloaded Man from 1961 is a kind of a prototypical early Ballard story about oblivion through technology, and you can draw a lot of comparisons from that story to others in the collection. Mr. F is Mr. F from 1961 is a Benjamin Button as a horror story, and he also kind of explores a similar idea with the story Time of Passage from 1963. One story I really enjoyed was Endgame from 1963, which doesn't really have any true science fiction markings. It's kind of a Sartre-esque existentialist story about a man who's imprisoned and he's living with a guard, and they start playing chess together. It really reminded me of some of the existentialist work that I've read, where he's just kind of waiting to find out, like, when am I going to be executed? What is going to happen to me? And the kind of psychological games he plays with himself, and also kind of explored through the chess game that he's playing with the prison guard. I thought it stood out because it didn't have as much science fiction dressing as a lot of the other stories. Minus One from 1963 is about a patient at a mental institution who goes missing, but no one really understands why. And I recently rewatched The Phantom of Liberty by Buñuel, and there's a section in that movie where a little girl goes missing, but she's actually there the whole time. And the parents go to file a police report, but the girl is there, but they're like, she's gone missing, but she's like standing right there. So there's an absurdity to it. Even though it's clearly surreal or absurdist, it has a kernel of reality and is poignant because of the ways in which people are unseen in society or ignored in society. But also it's just like a funny and terrifying concept. The Drowned Giant from 1964 was another story that really stood out to me. And the concept there is that a giant dead carcass of like a humanoid washes up on the ocean beach. The story just follows that concept to its logical end, where people are first discovering this thing, it becomes a huge media story, and then people start trying to find ways to profit off of it or take pieces of it for himself, and this body is decaying on the beach. And I think this is sort of starting the beginning of a period where Ballard is less interested in a clean fable or a clean resolution to his stories. The Recognition from 1967 is really one of my favorite short stories of all time. And I first read it actually in Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions collection. And I might do an episode about that collection at some point. The Recognition and another story called Riders of the Purple Wage by Philip Jose Farmer stood out to me as the most dangerous of the Dangerous Visions. A lot of the other Dangerous Visions, so-called Dangerous Visions from 1967, didn't seem all that dangerous, but there was something about The Recognition and Riders of the Purple Wage that stood out. And I think The Recognition, for a lot of readers, it's going to be too ambiguous and too inscrutable to be satisfying, or you might just think it's pretentious, but I actually think the way it's written and the way it unfolds is just so beautiful. The story itself is about a man who sees that there's a carnival coming into his town, and sort of on the periphery of this carnival, there's a woman who is both like, looks like she's 20 and 70. It's like unclear how old she is, and a dwarf, and they have these cages, and the man can't really quite see what's in the cages, and I don't want to give anything away, but it really stands out in this collection because Ballard doesn't really have any stories that are not from a contemporary, or at least contemporary from when he was writing, period. The story seems separate in a lot of ways, and it's unclear when it takes place, but it could take place anytime in the last 500 years, or however long carnivals have been happening. So it's just one of my favorite short stories of all time, and there's something about the ambiguity and the inscrutability of it that I think is done perfectly. You're always walking a fine line when you're playing with ambiguity as an artist, because I think it can go easily into self-indulgence. But if you're able to walk that fine line, it can be one of the most hair-raising and spectacular experiences for an audience, I think. 1972's The Greatest Television Show on Earth is, I think, a good example of the sinister sense of humor that Ballard has. The concept is that humanity has discovered a version of time travel, but the first instinct is to create television shows that take place in these like massive historical events. What they discover is the television producers discover that these events are not as exciting as history made them out to be. So like they go to see Napoleon, Waterloo battles, or other big battles, and it's just like there's not as many soldiers there. Nothing, it's not as spectacular as history or film has made it out to be. So they end up going back in time and kind of adding actors to the events in the past to make them more sensational for modern audiences. So there's a really funny and dark sensibility there that I thought worked really well, especially in the short story format. Similarly, The Life and Death of God from 1976 has that kind of tone where it's exploring in a kind of tongue-in-cheek, almost sarcastic way, what would happen if the existence of God was literally proven, and how that would affect society and how humanity would corrupt it. Notes Towards a Mental Breakdown from 1976 is one of the earlier examples in the collection of Ballard experimenting with form. This story starts with a sentence, and each word in the sentence has a footnote. And then through the footnotes, you're getting kind of contradictory details about the sentence. And I just really love this story. It's a really fun concept, and it's executed in a brilliant way. That same year, 1976, and I would say that this mid-70s period is really where Ballard comes into his own. The 60-minute Zoom is a moment-to-moment dissection of this obsessive guy with a camera's, what he's seeing through his zoom lens on his video camera as he's spying on his wife in another building. It's sort of like a Rear Window Hitchcock concept, but the way that Ballard uses it is unique. The Ultimate City from 1976, so again, he was really pumping out these stories, is one of the longer stories in the collection, and I think it's one of his best in terms of plot, in terms of storytelling, like in a way that could have been a larger novel. But it's a young man who has this like flying device, and he goes onto this island, and it's this dystopian dead society, and then it's sort of like about how he tries to build it up with these other people who have been abandoned on this island, and the inevitable corruption. So it's kind of like a dystopia, then a utopia, then a dystopia. But this is a great longer piece in the collection. Another interesting story around this period is Motel Architecture from 1978, which is about a guy who's totally isolated in his apartment, and he's obsessed with analyzing the movie Psycho frame by frame, and he has a cleaning lady that is the only person he interacts with, and it's a descent into madness. Also a very Ballardian typical story. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, like you want to break up these stories because it's an overwhelming experience. And I wouldn't necessarily call it repetitive, but at some point you're kind of like, oh, another dark tale about technology and alienation. Report on an Unidentified Space Station from 1982, I think, is a precursor to something like House of Leaves by Danielewski, I think, in which there's a space station that the actual size of it is expanding and contracting the way that in House of Leaves, the house is always fluctuating in terms of its actual size. Like the outside of the house in that book is one size, but the inside is larger. The Man Who Walked on the Moon from 1985 is one of my very favorite stories in the collection, and it's probably the saddest of his stories. And it's about a man who, he's kind of a down on his luck journalist, but he's heard that there's this guy who goes to these cafes that claims he was an astronaut who had been on the moon, which everyone knows isn't true because all the astronauts are known. But this guy really believes it, and he's incredibly poor, and he is begging for money and telling these stories. And I don't want to give too much away here, but it is not really a science fiction story, except that it is addressing the way that human spaceflight and aeronautics and manifest destiny affects our perception of reality. And like I said earlier, Ballard kind of abandons the tidy resolution of the science fiction stories he started with, but this one still is satisfying in an oblique way for me. One of the last short stories in this collection, I think The Matrix had a lot of influences, but I think this is a pretty clear example of something that probably influenced The Matrix, or at least influenced a lot of the ideas surrounding it. This is from a report from an obscure planet from 1992, so one of the last stories in the collection. And in this story, it's sort of like an alien race, or you don't even know exactly, but they're reporting on what clearly was the demise of the human race on Earth. A possible explanation, and this is an explanation for what happened, occurs to us as we prepare to return to our home star. Driven by the need for a more lifelike replica of the scenes of carnage that most entertained them, the people of this unhappy world had invented an advanced and apparently interiorized version of their television screens, a virtual replica of reality in which they could act out their most deviant fantasies. These three-dimensional simulations were generated by their computers and had reached a stage of development in the last years of the millennium in which the imitation of reality was more convincing than the original. It may even have become the new reality to the extent that their cities and highways, their fellow citizens, and ultimately themselves seemed mere illusions by comparison with the electronically generated amusement park where they preferred to play. Here they could assume any identity, create and fulfill any desire, and explore the most deviant dreams. So yeah, I highly recommend this massive collection of short stories from J G Ballard, and I'm really excited to read more of his novels, especially Crash, which is considered a high watermark for him, and The Crystal World, High Rise, Concrete Island. You know, he has a lot of work. He's a brilliant writer, and I think he's a sort of a Nostradamus character. If you enjoyed this episode or our content here at the Prison for Kids channel, please like and subscribe, and check out Cesar's show Vinyl Roulette, and we also have music videos and other content from the band on the channel. You can also check out more about the band at prisonforkids.com, and if you want to check out our full discography, pretty much it's all available on prisonforkids.bandcamp.com. Thanks so much for watching. Keep it weird.